I would like to welcome you to Monday's edition of our study through the book of 2 Corinthians. Today we're in 2 Corinthians, the second chapter, starting with verse number 12. Now, the Apostle Paul is going to begin to talk about his trip to Corinth. And you say, well, why does he talk about this? Well, there's a couple reasons. First of all, the Apostle Paul is trying to convey to the people in Corinth how much he cares about them and how much he loves them. But second of all, we see that the Apostle Paul is very human. We see him going through struggles. We see him going through times where he's in distress. And, many times when we read and we almost make the Apostle Paul to be some kind of superhuman type of person. But he's not. He is a man called by God. He is a man operating in the grace of God. He is a man operating in the power of God, in the Spirit of God. And you know what? You can do the same thing. Yeah, I said you can do the same thing. You see, when we look at the Apostle Paul's life now, and starting in verse number 12, we're seeing that the Apostle Paul, number one, loves the Corinthian church. Number two, the Apostle Paul is human. So let's take a look. This is what it says. Now, when I came to Troas for the gospel of Christ, and when a door was opened to me in the Lord. That's verse number 12. What's the Apostle Paul saying? Well, we need to understand that this is the Apostle Paul's third missionary journey. And he's been in Ephesus, and he's left Ephesus, and he's gone to Troas. Now, Troas is the way that you would go if you were going to go over to Macedonia. So you would go up from Ephesus, you would cross over and go into the city of Troas, and then you would begin to walk all the way through to Macedonia. So Paul says, when I came to Troas, and then he adds this, for the gospel of Christ. Why was the Apostle Paul doing what he was doing? He was doing it for the sake of the gospel of Christ. Now, later on this week, we're going to talk about people who preach the gospel for their own sake. But now Paul is laying it out very clearly. The reason why he went to Troas was for the sake of the gospel, for the gospel of Christ. He went to Troas to preach the gospel of Christ. He didn't go there on a vacation. He didn't go there on a business trip. He went there to preach the gospel of Christ. And then he says, and when a door opened to me in the Lord. Now, we understand this, that the Apostle Paul is saying, I didn't go to Troas until the Lord opened the door. We need to understand that God is still in the business of opening and closing doors. And so the Apostle Paul here is in Ephesus. Things are not very good for the Apostle Paul in Ephesus. We found that out when we studied 1 Corinthians. The Apostle Paul is in a place where the persecution has stepped up, and the Apostle Paul is in trouble in Ephesus. He's in trouble from false teachers, but he's also in trouble from the Roman government now. And so, but he stays in Ephesus until God opens the door. Now, we don't know exactly what this door was that the Apostle Paul had opened to him. Maybe it was his ability to sneak out of the country. Maybe it was the finances that he needed to board the ship to go to Troas. We don't know exactly what the open door was, but we understand that Paul says it was the Lord. It wasn't me. It wasn't someone else who opened the door for me. It was the Lord who opened the door for me. And so therefore I have gone on to Troas. Now verse number 13 says this: I had no rest for my spirit. What's Paul saying? He's saying when I got to Troas, he says, I didn't have any rest for my spirit. Now, Paul's spirit was telling him something. Paul's spirit was saying and speaking to the Apostle Paul. And so when he says that he has no rest, in other words, his spirit kept egging him on. You see, the Apostle Paul could have very easily said, you know what? I don't find Titus here. So therefore, I'm just gonna sit here in Troas and I'm gonna wait for Titus to come. Now let me just say this to you. When God has opened a door for you, it's very important that you keep moving. That's one of the lessons that we get from the Apostle Paul. When there's an open door, you continue to move. You don't say, well, I'm just going to wait for a more convenient time. I'm just going to wait and take a little rest here in Troas. I'm just going to wait. No, the Apostle Paul said, in my spirit. He said, in my spirit, in my inner man, the Greek word is pneuma, which means the inner man, in my spirit. And what does he say? I had no rest. In other words, my spirit is compelling me to keep moving. We need to understand that the Apostle Paul was a man who was led by his spirit man. And so he says, when I got to Troas, he said, I had no rest in my spirit. And then he goes on, he says, not finding Titus, my brother. He went to Troas to meet up with Titus. One of the things that the Apostle Paul did occasionally is he traveled alone. Every time he traveled alone, he gets this uneasy feeling. So he gets to Troas and he doesn't find Titus. He's expecting to see Titus waiting on him. And so what does the Apostle Paul do? He keeps moving. He keeps moving towards the objective that God has given him. What was that objective? To go to Macedonia and then to go to Corinth. And then he goes on and he says, taking leave of them. Well, who was them that he's talking about? He's talking about the church in Troas. He's talking about the believers that were in Troas. And he says, taking leave of them. In other words, moving on. He says, then at the end of verse 13, I went to Macedonia. Why was he going to Macedonia? Well, there was a couple reasons why he was going to Macedonia. The Apostle Paul was going to Macedonia, first of all, to visit the churches. He was the apostle. He was the one that started the churches in Thessalonica, Philippi. He was going to go and check on these churches. But he was also going to go to Macedonia to collect an offering that he had told them that they needed to take for the saints that were in Jerusalem. And so Paul leaves. He gets to Philippi. And by the way, the letter of 2 Corinthians is written from Philippi. And what happens in Philippi? He finds Titus. And what does Titus do? Titus gives him great news. The church at Corinth has repented. The church of Corinth has been reconciled to God. Now, we're going to continue tomorrow in our study in the book of 2 Corinthians, so I hope that you joined us. God bless you. Thank you for watching.